that government financial surveillance were impossible in democratic societies. The House Judiciary Committee's 2024 report exposed exactly what privacy advocates had been warning about for years: systematic financial surveillance operating far beyond legal boundaries. Federal agencies weren't just monitoring suspicious transactions, they were collecting private financial data on millions of Americans through back-channel communications with major banks and financial institutions. The Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network and the FBI had established direct data-sharing relationships with Bank of America, PayPal, Charles Schwab, HSBC, U.S. Bank, and Barclays. These weren't formal legal requests with judicial oversight. These were ongoing surveillance partnerships that allowed government agencies to monitor customer transactions in real time without warrants or probable cause. The surveillance programs used keyword filtering systems that targeted political terms like MAGA and Trump in transaction descriptions. Americans were being flagged for investigation based on purchases from stores like Cabela's, Bass Pro Shop, and Dick's Sporting Goods because government analysts decided these retailers attracted customers with Second Amendment interests. The surveillance wasn't targeting criminal activity. It was profiling Americans based on their political beliefs and constitutional rights. The Domestic Security Alliance Council, a public-private partnership run by the FBI and Department of Homeland Security, operated a web portal that shared intelligence products with financial institutions. The portal helped banks identify individuals who fit profiles of domestic violent extremists based on constitutionally protected activities like political beliefs, religious views, and lawful firearm purchases. Conservative political viewpoints were essentially being criminalized through financial surveillance. The NSA Section 702 surveillance program, originally designed for foreign intelligence, expanded into domestic financial monitoring through programs called PRISM and Upstream. PRISM allowed the NSA to obtain communications directly from tech companies like Facebook, Google, Apple, and Microsoft, while Upstream intercepted financial communications as they flowed through internet infrastructure. The FBI routinely searched these databases to examine Americans' private financial communications for domestic investigations unrelated to national security. The scale of Section 702 surveillance grew dramatically over time, with the government targeting communications of 232,432 individuals, groups, and organizations in 2021. Given the expansion rate, government agencies were probably collecting over 1 billion communications annually under surveillance authorities never intended for domestic financial monitoring. The ACLU documented how virtually every email entering or leaving the United States was being scanned for suspicious keywords. FBI agents conducted millions of backdoor searches of surveillance databases to examine private communications and transaction records without warrants. These searches were being used for criminal investigations completely unrelated to terrorism or foreign intelligence, turning surveillance programs into general law enforcement tools. The searches violated Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures. In March 2025, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court authorized new certifications for counter-narcotics operations, allowing the FBI to categorize drug-related financial transactions as foreign intelligence. This expansion broadened surveillance of Americans who had no connection to international drug trafficking, showing how surveillance authorities consistently expanded beyond their original purposes. The constitutional violations from these programs were massive and ongoing. Government agencies were conducting warrantless searches of millions of Americans' financial records based solely on algorithmic profiling. The programs violated due process rights by flagging citizens for investigation without probable cause or evidence of criminal activity. The Fourth Amendment's protections against unreasonable searches became meaningless when applied to digital financial transactions. Financial privacy advocates who warned about expanding government surveillance were systematically dismissed as paranoid conspiracy theorists. Organizations like the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the American Civil Liberties Union spent years filing lawsuits and publishing reports about financial surveillance overreach, only to be labeled as anti-government extremists undermining national security efforts. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, operating in complete secrecy, expanded surveillance scope through classified rulings that the public never saw. The court's responsibilities changed dramatically from overseeing targeted surveillance to authorizing sweeping programs that assessed constitutionality without public participation or review. The ACLU fought for years to bring transparency to this secretive court system. Legal challenges to these surveillance programs proceeded through federal courts, with the ACLU filing class action lawsuits representing millions of Americans whose financial privacy was violated. The cases challenged the authority of government agencies to conduct bulk financial surveillance without judicial oversight, arguing that the programs exceeded legal authorities and violated constitutional protections. Government agencies desperately tried to retroactively legalize these surveillance programs through emergency legislation and classified legal interpretations. The FBI and Treasury Department lobbied Congress to authorize the financial surveillance they'd already been conducting for years, essentially asking for permission to continue violating constitutional rights they'd been violating all along. The conspiracy about comprehensive financial surveillance wasn't some dystopian future scenario that privacy advocates were warning about. It was documented reality operating with the cooperation of major financial institutions. Every digital transaction Americans made was being monitored, analyzed, and stored by government agencies operating outside legal frameworks designed to protect financial privacy and constitutional rights. The pattern of surveillance expansion, legal justification, and public denial that characterized financial monitoring programs would prove to be just one example of how powerful institutions coordinated their activities behind the scenes. The same techniques for managing public perception and controlling information flow that enabled financial surveillance would soon be exposed in other sectors where institutional coordination was supposed to be impossible. Corporate media coordination scandals. The CIA's Operation Mockingbird shows us that media manipulation conspiracies weren't just theoretical possibilities that paranoid people worried about. They were systematic institutional practices with documented evidence and congressional investigations. From the 1950s through the 1970s, the CIA recruited journalists and media executives to spread propaganda and disinformation through mainstream news outlets, giving intelligence agencies direct control over news coverage and public discourse. Mockingbird involved paying journalists at major newspapers, magazines, and television networks to write articles promoting CIA interests while suppressing stories that might damage intelligence operations. The program gave the agency influence over news coverage at the Washington Post, New York Times, CBS, Time magazine, and dozens of other major media outlets. Journalists were literally on CIA payrolls while presenting themselves as independent reporters serving the public interest. The conspiracy theorists who warned about government control of media were ridiculed by the same journalists who were secretly working for intelligence agencies. Critics who suggested that news coverage was being manipulated by government operatives were dismissed as paranoid extremists who didn't understand how journalism actually worked. The irony was that some of the journalists dismissing these theories were literally receiving CIA paychecks for their propaganda work. CIA operatives worked directly with editors and publishers to plant false stories, kill unfavorable coverage, and shape public opinion on foreign policy issues. The agency could essentially dictate news coverage of international events, domestic politics, and intelligence operations through their network of recruited media assets. Stories that might expose CIA activities or challenge official government narratives were systematically suppressed across multiple news outlets. The program allowed intelligence agencies to manipulate public discourse without the public knowing they were consuming government propaganda disguised as independent journalism. Americans thought they were reading objective news coverage when they were actually being fed carefully crafted intelligence operation talking points designed to support CIA objectives and foreign policy goals. Mockingbird recruitment targeted influential journalists and media executives who could shape coverage across entire news organizations. The CIA didn't just want individual reporters. They wanted people who could influence editorial decisions, story assignments, and coverage priorities at major news outlets. The goal was systematic control over information flow, rather than just occasional planted stories. The Church Committee investigations in the 1970s exposed Operation Mockingbird along with other illegal CIA domestic operations, but most of the documentation had been destroyed to prevent full exposure of the program's scope. Congressional investigators found evidence of CIA relationships with journalists at over 50 American news organizations, but the actual number was probably much higher because records had been systematically destroyed. Former CIA officials who testified before Congress described Mockingbird as a routine intelligence operation rather than an aberration or rogue program. The agency considered media manipulation to be a standard tool for advancing American interests overseas and controlling domestic political discourse. Intelligence operatives saw nothing wrong with using American journalists as propaganda assets because they believed the ends justified the means. The program continued operating even after congressional exposure because the legal reforms that followed the Church Committee investigations focused on oversight rather than eliminating the underlying authorities that enabled media manipulation. Intelligence agencies learned to operate within reformed legal frameworks while still conducting activities that violated the spirit of press freedom and democratic governance. Journalists who participated in Mockingbird defended their cooperation with intelligence agencies by claiming they were serving national security interests and fighting communist propaganda. They argued that working with the CIA was patriotic duty rather than journalistic corruption, showing how intelligence agencies successfully convince media professionals to abandon their ethical obligations to the public. The conspiracy theorists who warned about CIA media control understood something that mainstream journalists missed. Intelligence agencies would use their secrecy authorities and financial resources to manipulate public opinion through supposedly independent news outlets. They correctly predicted that government propaganda operations would target American citizens rather than limiting themselves to foreign audiences. Independent journalists who exposed CIA media relationships faced professional retaliation and personal attacks designed to destroy their credibility. Intelligence agencies used their media assets to discredit reporters who were investigating government propaganda operations, creating a system where journalists who exposed media manipulation were attacked by the same outlets that were being manipulated. The techniques developed during Operation Mockingbird evolved into more sophisticated influence operations that continued into the digital age. The same institutional incentives that drove Cold War propaganda programs created the information warfare capabilities that intelligence agencies use today through social media platforms and online news outlets. What made Mockingbird particularly effective was how it operated through legitimate news organizations rather than obvious propaganda outlets. Americans trusted major newspapers and television networks to provide objective information, so they were vulnerable to manipulation when those outlets were secretly serving intelligence agency interests rather than public information needs. The pattern of recruitment, manipulation, and cover-up that characterized Mockingbird established precedents for how powerful institutions could control information flow while maintaining plausible deniability about their influence operations. The program showed that systematic deception could operate for decades within trusted institutions without public detection or accountability. The conspiracy theorists weren't just right about the existence of government media manipulation. They correctly understood that intelligence agencies would prioritize propaganda effectiveness over democratic values like press freedom and informed public discourse. The documented evidence proved that their warnings about institutional manipulation were accurate predictions rather than paranoid speculation. But government control of media was just one example of how powerful institutions learned to manipulate information systems that the public assumed were independent and trustworthy. The same techniques for hiding institutional coordination and suppressing inconvenient information would soon be exposed in other sectors where public trust was essential for institutional legitimacy. Environmental data suppression operations. The asbestos industry conspiracy shows us how corporations learned to hide deadly health information from workers and the public for decades while people died from preventable diseases. Internal company documents revealed that executives at Johns Manville, Asbestos Manhattan, and other major asbestos manufacturers knew their products caused cancer and lung disease as early as the 1930s, but they deliberately suppressed this information to protect their profits. Company executives received medical reports showing that asbestos workers were developing lung diseases at alarming rates, but instead of warning workers or improving safety conditions, they hired their own doctors to conduct studies that would downplay the health risks. They funded research designed to create doubt about the link between asbestos and disease, while suppressing studies that showed clear evidence of harm. The conspiracy involved multiple levels of deception and cover-up that operated for over 4 decades. Companies removed warning labels from asbestos products, fought against workplace safety regulations, and lobbied government agencies to avoid restrictions on asbestos use. They hired public relations firms to spread disinformation about asbestos safety and funded front groups that appeared to be independent scientific organizations, but were actually industry propaganda operations. Workers who developed asbestos-related diseases were told their illnesses were caused by other factors like smoking or genetic predisposition. Company doctors would diagnose workers with less serious conditions to avoid acknowledging asbestos-related diseases that might trigger workers' compensation claims or regulatory scrutiny. The companies maintained this deception while thousands of workers died from mesothelioma, lung cancer, and other asbestos-related diseases. Internal memos between company executives revealed the calculated nature of their deception. A 1966 memo from Bendix Corporation stated that asbestos health hazards were well documented, but recommended against warning workers because it might stir up a hornet's nest. Another memo from Johns Manville executives discussed how to buy time by funding studies that would delay regulatory action while continuing to sell deadly products. The conspiracy theorists who claimed that corporations were deliberately poisoning workers for profit were ridiculed by industry experts and government officials who insisted that American companies would never knowingly harm their employees. Medical professionals who questioned asbestos safety were attacked as alarmists who didn't understand industrial hygiene. Worker advocates who demanded better safety protections were dismissed as anti-business extremists. Company lawyers developed sophisticated legal strategies to delay and minimize liability for asbestos-related diseases. They would challenge medical evidence linking asbestos to specific illnesses, argue that other factors caused workers' diseases, and use procedural tactics to drag out litigation for years. The goal was to exhaust victims' resources and force them to accept minimal settlements rather than pursuing full compensation. The asbestos companies coordinated their deception through industry trade associations and shared research that helped them maintain consistent messaging about product safety. The Asbestos Information Association, funded by major manufacturers, published materials claiming that asbestos was safe when properly handled, despite internal company documents showing that no level of exposure was safe. Insurance companies that provided coverage for asbestos manufacturers were also part of the conspiracy, helping companies hide the true scope of health risks from regulators and the public. Insurance executives knew about asbestos dangers from their own actuarial studies, but continued providing coverage while helping companies develop strategies to minimize liability exposure. The truth only emerged through litigation in the 1970s and 1980s, when internal company documents were forced into public view through court proceedings. The documents revealed decades of deliberate deception, showing that company executives knew about asbestos dangers but chose to prioritize profits over worker safety. The conspiracy theorists had been right about both the scope of corporate knowledge and the deliberate nature of the cover-up. By the time the cover-up was exposed, over 27 million Americans had been exposed to asbestos in their workplaces, and hundreds of thousands would eventually die from asbestos-related diseases. The companies that knew about these dangers for decades continued selling their products and exposing new workers to deadly hazards while maintaining public positions that asbestos was safe. The regulatory response to asbestos exposure came decades too late, because government agencies relied on industry-funded research rather than conducting independent safety assessments.